Hi everyone. So this week's portion is the portion of Vayechi. And in the beginning, let's just talk a little bit about what this portion actually is about. And basically, this week's reading covers the final years of Jacob. And right before he passes, Jacob blesses Joseph's children as well as his own. And of course, then there's a massive funeral procession, and Jacob's body is taken to Canaan, the land of Canaan, but later he is buried in Israel. So Jacob lived his last 17 years in Egypt, and when Jacob sensed that he was about to pass from the world, that his days were numbered, he called Joseph and asked him to promise him that he would bury him in Israel. Joseph, of course, accepts it, and then Jacob becomes sick, and Joseph visits him, and he brings his two sons, Menashe and Ephraim. And basically, Jacob then blesses Menashe and Ephraim. And that's the beginning of the portion. Then, when Joseph brings his two sons to Jacob to get a blessing, he puts Menashe, his firstborn, on Jacob's right, and he puts Ephraim on Jacob's left. And Jacob, who was almost blind at this point, crossed his hands, putting his right hand on Ephraim and his left hand on Menashe. And he blesses him, "And the angel who redeemed me from all harm, bless the youths, and may they be called by name and the name of my fathers, Abraham and Isaac, and may they multiply abundantly like fish in the midst of the land." This blessing is a blessing that we use every Friday night on Shabbat to bless our children. So if anybody has any questions about that, I would love to talk to you personally. Now, Joseph doesn't understand why his father did this, because Ephraim wasn't the firstborn. And he tried to fix Jacob's hands, but Jacob said, "I know what I'm doing. Leave me alone, I know what I'm doing." And he kept on with the blessings. After this, Jacob calls all his sons and talks about personal messages for each one of them, and it goes into different things that the children did, and he gives success and blessings to everyone. And then he, of course, again asks to be buried in Israel, in Hebron, in the cave of the Machpelah. If anybody has been with us in Israel, you know where he's buried. Jacob then asks to be buried in the Machpelah, in Hebron, and he passes away at the age of 147. And Yosef, it says, lived until the age of 110, and before he passed away, he told his brothers that God eventually would take them out of Egypt and bring them to Israel. And Joseph asked his brothers to promise that when that time arrived, they would carry his remains again into Israel. That's basically the overview of the portion. Now, I'd like to go into a book called The Torah Anthology and speak a little bit deeper about the portion. And as I know you're going to edit this. So, it says, Jacob lived in the land of Egypt for 17 years. Jacob's days, the years of his life, were 147 years. So, this is kind of like a weird verse, but by carefully looking at everything that was written until now, we can see that Jacob had basically troubles all his life. First, Esau wanted to kill him. Then he fled to Padan Aram, and someone by the name of Eliphaz intercepted him and took all of his possessions, stole everything from him, and basically left him naked and without food. And he didn't even have a pillow to sleep on. And then he went to live with Lavan, who there he served for 20 years. And if you remember, Lavan tricked him. He was working 7 years. He wanted Rachel. Then he had to work another 7 years for Rachel because he was given Leah. And he worked really hard during those 20 years. He didn't even sleep. But Lavan never really appreciated him. And then when Jacob returned home, Esau came with hundreds of troops to kill him. And he was alone in the field at night, and Esau's guardian angel came to wrestle with him until the morning, striking him and dislocating his hip. And this was, of course, followed by the disaster that happened to his daughter Dinah in Shechem. And all of these stories you can read in previous portions in the Bible. And not that happened, and then, of course, the disappearance of Yosef, the selling of Yosef, and who was his favorite son. And he didn't know if he was alive or dead. He was in mourning for 22 years. And during that time, he was weeping all the time. He was heartbroken. Anybody who came close to him knew that he was heartbroken. And so when he sent his sons to Egypt to buy grain during the famine, he had twice as much grief, because first Shimon was held hostage, and then he had to send Benjamin, who was Rachel's other son, and he refused to send him. He didn't want to send him. So in all, Jacob didn't have a single good day in all the years that he lived. Now, the Torah tells us that Jacob lived in the land of Egypt for 17 years. What does this mean? That during these 17 years in Egypt, Jacob truly lived happy and content. His years before were considered suffering, but the 17 years that the Creator gave him in Egypt, he was so happy. He had Joseph with him, he had all his sons, and he was very, very happy. The days of his passing from the world grew closer, and he knew it. And so he called for Yosef and said to him, "If I have found favor in your eyes, please place your hand under my thigh. Do true kindness with me, and do not bury me in Egypt. Let me lie with my fathers. Carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their grave," which is what I said before, the cave of the Machpelah. So what do we learn here? The scripture teaches us that the main life of a righteous person, a tzaddik, is really in the next world. It's not in this world. And their days are not considered as significant in this world as they are in the next world. Because even if a person lives 1,000 years, his lifetime goes by so fast. And the moment he dies, it seems to him like he left through one door and went into another. So basically, this world is like a passageway to the next world. And so they're constantly making sure that their families are okay, that everything they're doing is positive. And so we see that with all of the patriarchs, they actually spoke about their death because they knew they were departing from the world. They knew that they couldn't obtain all the spirituality that they wanted to attain on this physical level. So they talked about their death. And Jacob prayed that the Creator would allow him to live longer so that he would be able to go into Israel, but he knew that it was his time to pass, and that's why he had asked his son to make sure that he buries him in Israel. Now, at the time that he knew that he was passing, he wasn't sick, but he knew that he didn't have a lot of time left. And that's why he asked Joseph to make sure that he's buried in Israel. Now, it says, "Do true kindness with me." What does that mean, true kindness? It says that the true kindness that you can do is after the death of a person. Because after the death of a person, if you do something for them, you can't get anything back. You can't expect anything back. So really, that's true kindness. Because you're doing something where you know you're not going to get any physical or even not spiritual, but when we do something nice for somebody, even a smile is something that we get back. Here, he was asking Yosef, do an act of true kindness because you're not going to get anything back. And of course, that's what happened. Now, when Jacob came to the land of Canaan, he was concerned that the divine presence, that the Creator would leave him and his children would disappear among the nations. He was afraid that he wouldn't have his legacy go on. He was also concerned that the Egyptians would make him into a god if he stayed there. So because they saw Jacob's greatness, they knew that the famine ended as soon as he came into the land. And so he made sure that his bones would be buried in the cave of Machpelah. And Joseph, as Jacob's son, didn't even think that it would be proper for him to put his hand under his thigh, but he said, "I will do as you say. I'm kind of swearing that I will take you out of Egypt." So at first, Jacob asked Joseph to swear that he would make an effort to bring him to the Machpelah in Chevron. And when Yosef said, I myself will bring you there, he knew that it would happen. Now, there's a couple of things more that I'd like to share with you from Shem Shmuel. You know, really this portion, it's very funny that it falls in this week of New Year's, but this portion is the last portion in the book of Genesis. And it's the end of an era. It's the end of the era of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They were the three patriarchs. And this is the time where it comes to an end. And in this last section, we learn about the death of Jacob and the death of Joseph. Jacob, knowing that he was going to die soon, started preparing everything, and he knew that he was going to leave this world, and he wanted to make sure that he would leave this world by blessing the two sons of Joseph, Ephraim and Manasseh. But when Jacob told Joseph, he says to him, "And now your two sons who were born to you in the land of Egypt, before I arrived, are mine, Ephraim and Manasseh, like Reuben and Shimon are mine." What does this mean? So Shem Shmuel explains, it's known that a person gives birth to someone, he passes on his nature and personality. I mean, our kids have a lot of our nature and our personalities. Jacob, in the house of his father-in-law, Lavan, was alone. He was trapped in Lavan's house. Lavan was a liar. He was a trickster. And he couldn't even talk to him because he was afraid that if he talked to him, he would get involved in some kind of witchcraft or negativity. He was so alone that he could only do on his own strengthening the tie with the Creator. He had to be alone. He had to pray. He had to meditate. He had to study. He couldn't talk to anyone about that. And that was very different from Abraham, who actually went around, and Abraham and Isaac's job was to go around and bring people closer to the Creator, where Jacob had to seclude himself. He had to strengthen his connection to the Creator alone. And basically that's what Jacob's children inherited, where they couldn't socialize with people, but they had to, between themselves, make their bonds stronger between themselves and with the Creator. And that's how they could raise themselves on a higher spiritual plane. So God established a covenant with each and every one of his children, of Jacob's children, that they would never disappear from the face of the earth. Actually, the opposite. Each tribe would go on to establish their own spiritual path within, of course, the spiritual system that we have of the Torah. And everything would stay there for generations. And it says that the 10 lost tribes haven't disappeared. It's just that we don't know who they are. We can't today identify who the 10 tribes are. Based on this explanation, we can understand why it wasn't Abraham or Isaac who actually had the 12 tribes, the 12 children, because they were not the ones whose job it was to make sure that spirituality and monotheism would keep on going. Now, if we fast forward to the years of Joseph in Egypt, we see that he also was in the same kind of place where Jacob was in the house of Lavan, because even if he was involved with people in Pharaoh, in the palace, you know, he was administrating the Egyptians' financing and ruling their land, he still had no one to talk to. The Egyptians were not people with who he could converse, who he could, talk to and have connection to, because they had no idea what spirituality was. They had no idea what strengthening their connection with the Creator was. So Yosef was essentially alone in the world, and he had to mentally separate himself from the daily activities that he was doing, and so that he would be able to focus on doing alone his work with the Creator. And so naturally, his sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, were also born with these traits and personality, where they had to strengthen their connection to the Creator, again, working alone. So the same way that Jacob's sons had their own independent personality and approach to the Creator, Yosef's sons did as well. And so just as Jacob's sons deserved their own blessing, Jacob knew that Yosef's sons also deserved their own blessing. And that's why we can understand what Jacob meant in the words where he said, these children, Ephraim and Manasseh, even though they're yours and they were born even though I wasn't here, they're just like Reuben and Shimon to me, Reuben being the firstborn. So that's why they were worthy of the blessing. And so after he blessed Joseph's sons. Jacob, of course, blesses his own sons, and he makes sure that they each get their own part in the blessing. Now, what does this mean for us? I think that coming to the end of an era of the patriarchs, and really, what were we given by the patriarchs? Abraham and Isaac were the ones who basically spread the word of monotheism, spread the word of that there's one creator, and spread the word of spirituality. And Jacob actually was able to manifest through his children a system. And it's very interesting because Jacob and Joseph and Ephraim and Manasseh and all the children, all the tribes, had to work alone. They were in such a negative environment. They were in such a negative place where there was no one around them that they could talk to about the Creator and spirituality, that they had to keep their focus alone and strengthen their tie to the Creator alone. Today, in our times, the end of 2020, thank God, and hopefully, I'm sure 2021 will be a better year. Today, there's so much knowledge out there. There's so many people teaching spirituality, teaching Torah, teaching Kabbalah, teaching everything where you can use the internet. But when it comes down to it, and because we're forced to be at home so much, we're pretty much alone with our surrounding. And so I think for us, this week's portion helps us understand a couple of things. One, we need to appreciate that we have so much knowledge out there that we can connect to. And on the other hand, to do our internal work. And, at the end of the day, you're alone with yourself. Even if you're married, you have children, you have family, you have friends, you're alone with yourself when you make your connection to the Creator. And we were given the blessing this year to look inwards. A lot of contemplation, a lot of fighting with ourselves, a lot of struggling with everyone around us. At the end of the day, if we can connect to the era of Jacob and work internally on our connection to the Creator, we have the amazing merit that we have surroundings of people who are spiritual, who want to learn, who believe in the Creator. We need to appreciate our times and use both the internal working alone on our connection with the Creator and connecting to people around us and spreading the word of spirituality. Thank you and Happy New Year.